All right, all right. Want to welcome everybody here. Thank you all for showing up to today's event, updates from Kurdistan, a conversation with Aliza Marcus. My name is Arthur. I'm a member of the Emergency Committee for Rojava. If you're all hearing about this event and coming to this event from other channels and haven't heard about the Emergency Committee for Rojava, we are a grassroots group based here in the United States focused on raising awareness and support for the Kurdish freedom movement in northeast Syria and beyond. We're very inspired by the efforts to build a society based on pluralism and self-governance and women's autonomy in northeast Syria. And for many years, we've been doing our best to make sure people know about this inspiring movement and find ways to support it. And one of the things we try to do as a part of that work is grassroots popular education. We try to learn ourselves and open up opportunities for us to study the history of the Kurdish freedom movement, the history of the revolution in northeast Syria. Sometimes we have teach-ins and guest speakers. And today we are extremely lucky to be joined by Aliza Marcus. If you haven't heard of Aliza and her work already, she is a former Middle East-based journalist and the author of Blood and Belief, the PKK and the Kurdish Fight for Independence. She also has recently released a new book titled Resurgence and Revolution, the PKK and the Kurdish Fight in Turkey and Syria. If you haven't picked up a copy of this book and read it yourself, we certainly recommend doing so. Um, so first of all, Aliza, we just want to thank you for being here, joining us today for the conversation.
And thank you for having me. I mean, I follow your work, the emergency committee, and it's a great honor for me to be here.
Thank you so much. I think we definitely want to get into sort of the meat of your book itself, what you were trying to achieve here, what you learned, what you think we should take away from this kind of second chapter of the story of the Kurdish freedom movement, if you will, sort of the story you cover of the movement's transformation and development through the changes following the capture of Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan on through the emergence of this autonomous region in northeast Syria we all know as Rojava. But I think before we do that, we'd love to take advantage of having you here today and ask you to help kind of bring our audience up to speed about what the heck is going on the ground in northeast Syria today. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes in recent months, in recent years. Most people are probably aware that in December of 2024, the Assad regime fell to HTS. There's been a new Syrian regime in power. Most people are also aware, at least in this audience, that the movement in Rojava has been negotiating to try to find some settlement to the question of how much of the sort of gains of this revolution, the institutions and practices of self-governance, of women's autonomy, etc., will be preserved under a new Syrian state. But a lot of people are less aware of what's happened even more recently. This winter, of course, we saw another war that was frankly waged offensively by the Syrian regime, the new Syrian regime. The autonomous region in Rojava lost a lot of territory, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of this project, the gains of the revolution itself, and the future of the broader movement that really brought Rojava into being in the first place. So, if you could, please share with us your own understanding and analysis of just what has taken place since the fall of Assad and especially since the recent conflicts in January and February of this year.
Okay, thanks. It's a pretty broad question. So let me just start with one small anecdote. I was last in Rojava in November, and I met with Muslim Kobani then, among other people. And he told me this story about the day the Rojava Revolution began. So July 19th, 2012 is that day, 14 years ago. And he said the fighting started, he went to Kobani. They pushed out Syrian forces, and of course, some Syrian forces the regime just left as well. But in some areas there were clashes. He said he went to his parents' house, and he said to his mother, "You don't have to worry anymore. The Syrian soldiers are gone." So that was 14 years ago. So the question is, when we look at the Rojava Revolution, is what's the situation today, right? You know, is that sense of relief that Kurds felt in 2012 still there? And I think it's kind of a tough question to answer because on the one hand, you don't have a large number of Syrian forces in what's left of Rojava. You do have Kurdish forces that have been trained or sort of retrained by the Syrians, but are still there, but have been sent back to the Kurdish areas. But you've lost a huge part of territory that was held, and territory that um, the Rojava administration had been very proud of because it was part of taking the ideology, taking the view of towards women and minorities, and spreading it beyond Kurds through the Arab parts of northeastern Syria as well. And that was very important for showing that the ideology made sense and things worked. So I think right now, when we look at, what's happened since past couple of months, even or 9 months, let's say, since the last clashes with the Syrian state and the Kurds, the fact is that the Rojava Revolution is in flux. It was always in flux. I think those of us who were observers just sort of saw the situation a few years ago where Kurds really seemed to control everything and have a certain external respect and legitimacy as um, as that was the solution. And what we forgot is there are other players.
That makes a world of sense. And appreciate you giving us kind of the broad strokes. I'm wondering if you can share a bit more about your perspective on the future of the institutions that were built around this idea of democratic confederalism, this aspiration towards kind of bottom-up forms of self-governance, things like local communes, etc. What are the formal institutions that are being negotiated over to be integrated into the Syrian state? But also, what's your take on the kinds of institutions that may never be recognized by the Syrian state, but nonetheless, the movement has an ideological commitment one way or another to continuing to develop or defend. Where do you see this going in the months and years to come?
Yeah, so that's so in my book actually I go in depth into that issue. If you always had in the Rojava administration or the northeastern Syria, you had the official structures, mayoral seats, the parliament, things like that. But you also had kind of a more shadow system, run more ideologically, which had to do more with the communes and then going up to local parliaments and then moving up forward. And that was what really was pushing the idea of democratic confederalism. It was this kind of shadow force set up by the PKK and the PKK's local affiliate that was really there to implement Öcalan's ideology. That's not to say that the formal structures, Department of Education, Department of Economy, and so on, didn't also play their role. But you do have this two-prong approach to governance, which helps, which enables the ideology and some of the more grassroots efforts and the idea of democratic confederalism to continue. Now, we don't know where democratic confederalism is going to go because Öcalan has also shifted his ideology or his focus over the past year. But the fact is, when we see what's happening now, the formal structures are integrating, Department of Education, the health, all those are integrating, but my understanding is they're integrating as is. So the people who were in those roles are now moving into the same role, but now as part of the Syrian state. So it's not necessarily a huge shock. I mean, there are still things that have to be worked out, especially around education and language, and we see that going on constantly with stress and tension. But for the most part, many of the structures are integrating as is. And I think there's a legitimate question to be asked. How far does Shara want to go at this point to really ensure that everything is very much heavy-handed on under his control? And I do think that the Kurdish leadership there has found space to operate and to maintain some of the idealism that drove the revolution.
That's certainly encouraging to be reminded of the fact that this is not a movement that's been known for its willingness to give up easily, or its
Right.
inability to learn and adapt, which I'm sure we'll get into a little later in the conversation. Before we move on from this question of kind of bringing everybody up to speed about latest changes since the regime's offensive on the Northeast this winter. I'm wondering if you could share any perspectives of your own or those that you've heard from your own context about kind of internal discussions in the movement about lessons learned already, mistakes made. It's of course a little too early to tell. It's not as if this story is finished, but there already has been some profound losses that I think nobody really is denying. And I wonder, in other words, how much of this recent change you see as on the one hand, kind of the inevitable result of just a larger changing kind of balance in forces, a new White House administration under a new set of conditions, broader regional changes maybe since October 7th, versus how, to what extent you see or you feel the movement sees this as also the result of kind of internal mistakes or shortcomings about priorities in the process of negotiating some kind of settlement post the fall of Assad.
Look, first, my opinion is that the movement's never been very good at um, reviewing its mistakes. So that I come from that perspective. And in this case, though, there is a lot of discussion. I know there's been a lot of discussion internally about whether the administration should have made certain decisions earlier. Maybe they should have negotiated differently. Certainly, when they started negotiating with Shara, with Damascus, after he took power, things moved very slowly. Some people say, the administration felt that the longer they dragged this out, the more they would gain. That seems to have been a mistake in retrospect, but we don't know what they would have gained had they moved it a lot faster. But certainly, we can see that on two big areas, the movement and the administration made a mistake, which is they thought they had a certain amount of support and legitimacy internationally that never materialized. Their friends that they thought whether it's in the US military, the government, or in Europe, ended up not backing them. And we can put that down to a change in administration, whatever we want. But at the end of the day, it was a very big miscalculation. And probably one, had they thought about it more clearly, could have informed better some of their decision making. So, for example, should they have offered to trade away the Arab majority areas early on? Something like that might have taken a card away from Shara. Should they have tried to strike a deal with the KDP much earlier in the Iraqi Kurdish party, Barzani's party, because had they struck a deal or kind of overcome their differences with the Barzanis earlier on, maybe Barzani could have been more of a spokesperson for them with Turkey and with the United States and with Shara. So there's a lot of internal discussion. I know that's going on, but I don't know that we'll ever hear um, the final conclusion of this. But there have been hints that, Muslim made mistakes. That's one thing that I've heard a lot. But again, there's nothing concrete there that's coming out yet.
No, I really appreciate that, and it certainly echoes things that we've heard as well. I think it makes sense to maybe transition or zoom even further out, rather, to thinking about the broader context of the Kurdish movement, and specifically about what's been kind of coinciding with these changes in Northeast Syria, which has been this process, or at least aspiring process, of peace negotiations between the PKK and the Turkish state. Um, as many here have probably already heard, just to kind of lay the basis, right? The PKK, following Öcalan's proposal, request, demand, formally committed to disarming itself and even officially dissolving itself, at least in that form, as a Kurdistan Workers' Party. and moving kind of from a strategy of armed struggle to a strategy of political struggle, if you will. But I'm curious if you could sort of help us understand both what has been happening, what has prompted this move towards negotiations around the same time frame between the party and the Turkish state, and also in what ways is this process actually related directly or indirectly to um, the movement, the changes in the movement on the ground in northeast Syria?
Yeah, so
Two
it's interesting because
small questions for you.
there was just a big interview done by a Turkish journalist with Duran Kalkan, who's one of the top people in the PKK. And one thing he said, which struck me, was he said, when Öcalan made his first call, now over a year ago, we didn't expect it. We had no idea that this was going to happen. And certainly we saw that we sort of knew that because it took the PKK a while to respond and agree to Öcalan's call for disarmament and to dissolve the organization. But it was interesting to hear him say that because they've always been playing a little bit of catch up. PKK on the ground in Kandil, has never really known exactly what's going on in the prisons, in the prison with Öcalan and his negotiations with the state. And so, as a result, it's one of the reasons the peace process has gone on for so long. I think just the sort of difficulties of people talking to each other and getting word across, but also the hesitation. Really, I would argue on the Turkish side with an uncertainty over, what does the Turkish government want from this peace process? And it's still unclear, or maybe it is clear because the government often talks about we're going to end terror in Turkey. We're going to have peace in Turkey. That's about as far as they go. On the Kurdish side, on the movement side, they're talking about, they're still talking about we want rights, we want political freedoms, we want democracy, because only democracy will really free us. And right now we're sort of at the, in a day or two, we may know more because Abdullah Öcalan has just had a meeting with the Kurdish political party. I think it was today. And they're expected to make an announcement in a few days. What is it that he wants? What has he agreed with the Turkish state? So the process has been, I'd say it's been a little bit fraught. And it's also shown still that there is not always alignment between Kandil and Öcalan, which is not a surprise. I mean, Kandil's involved on the ground, they have the armed people, Öcalan is isolated, he only hears what the Turkish state wants him to hear. So, but I think for both sides recognize that they need each other. PKK needs Öcalan because he is the leader, he's the founder, he's what holds them together, and Öcalan needs the fighters in Kandil because without them, he's not the leader of anything. So, I mean, they do have this kind of interesting relationship. Now, what started the peace process? Nobody knows. I mean, I would argue that from Öcalan's perspective, he recognized that war was not going to solve anything anymore. The PKK's fight had been pushed out of Turkey years earlier. By 2015, there was the fight in the cities inside southeast Turkey that sparked a huge, very brutal and violent Turkish reaction, and slowly Turkey's technological advances meant that the war was pushed out of Turkey inside into Iraqi Kurdistan. So that was one of it. I think Öcalan recognized this. The other thing was certainly Rojava. Turkey has consistently threatened Rojava every time that there was an attack from the PKK. And Rojava is very important for the movement, for Öcalan personally, for Kurds. I think Öcalan saw the end of fighting with Turkey as also a way to help stabilize Rojava.
And do you think that that has paid off? I mean, of course, the logic made a lot of sense back in January. Now one has to wonder what those conversations are like internal to the movement after the regime took all this territory from Rojava. I'm not sure exactly where the quote came, but I remember there was a sort of analogy going around when the PKK had made its commitment to first disarming and dissolving. And it was the analogy of sort of like the mother's sacrificing herself for her
Right.
child, right? This idea that the gains made in Rojava were sort of the most advanced gains that the movement had ever achieved, and that this sort of willingness to put down arms in Bakur in southeast Turkey, um, had to do with this idea that what was most important was to preserve those gains. Do you have any sense that that internal calculus has changed, or that was ever the general framework?
Yeah, well, first, I don't actually agree with that
Yeah.
calculus. I've heard it before. I don't think Öcalan was trading one for another. I think he was
Yeah.
looking at this very broadly. Like I said, the fight in Iraqi Kurdistan was going nowhere. It just wasn't. PKK was living basically underground. It was very difficult for them. I mean, they could stay there, they could fight forever, but they weren't actually fighting inside Turkey or for Turkey anymore. So I think he may have also been kind of looking for a reason to end the war. What would, this worked out. I mean, certainly he wanted to protect the gains in Rojava, but I mean, there's also an argument that, Turkey would never have invaded. They invaded a part of Rojava, but would they have gone the whole way? Shara was getting legitimacy. There's a lot of business to be made in Syria. Another huge war wasn't going to benefit Turkey either, especially since they knew that as much as Rojava was used by the PKK, Rojava itself was not a threat to Turkey directly. So I think that that calculation isn't actually correct. I think that ultimately we don't know. This is the problem. We don't know what would have happened if they hadn't,
Sure.
if they hadn't made this agreement. But it also shows a limit of ideology. But the Rojava Revolution ultimately became, a revolution for all of Syria, right? This has always been Öcalan's. I mean, since after he was captured by Turkey in 1999, he really focused on this idea that, not only are we going to liberate areas for Kurds, but we're going to liberate and create democracy and freedoms for everybody. Not just in the Middle East, but ultimately, throughout the world. That was his view. It turned out that no matter how good your ideology is and how much freedom you give people, and whatever you're teaching in Raqqa or Deir ez-Zor or other Arab majority areas, when a state comes in that has legitimacy and has money and has power, that's where people tend to go. And that's what I think the lesson of this was. It wasn't necessarily that people in Raqqa didn't suddenly hated the ideology or hated the Kurdish administration. But I mean, the administration couldn't offer them anything at that point. Everything was going to come from Damascus. So
Right.
that's where people went.
Right. No, it does make sense. And for those of us who spend any time on the ground, you can see very clearly that there are communities that were, for years and generations in some cases had been a part of the kind of popular base of the movement. They were very much ideologically committed. These are places where the communes and these local councils were thriving the most, right? And then you had places where people's support was often fairly passive and pragmatic and predicated on a certain set of conditions that made it sort of pragmatic in a moment that could shift. And I think we've seen, right, some of those conditions just change in fundamentally different ways now. So what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, kind of playing on this theme to expand on the fact that it's one thing to have a righteous ideology and institutions that embody that ideology. It's another thing to actually be able to kind of win over the popular base to kind of buy into the project, to support and participate in it. I'm wondering how you see this kind of turned to Bakur again. We've heard a lot here and there about sort of forms of backlash in some ways brewing in the movement's popular base in southeast Turkey, as well as maybe especially in the Kurdish diaspora. People increasingly critical of the PKK, the broader movement, sometimes criticizing this very idea of these more high-minded ideals that we're going to democratize Turkey. I often hear things from sort of critical folks in the diaspora of, like, for example, how can we democratize Turkey if we can't even win gains for our own people in the southeast? And we may have like ideological affinity with the idea of democratizing the entire nation state under the framework of democratic confederalism until the state itself is transcended. But nonetheless, as you say, right, this is a game of politics and power and legitimacy. What have you seen change, especially recently, in the movements, the PKK specifically's relationship to its popular base in Turkey? And how might that shape what we can expect in the coming years and months about the success, the potential success of the movement moving towards a political form of struggle?
Right. So I mean, the PKK is, excuse me, always had, I mean, Öcalan actually, especially after his capture in 1999, you know, shifted a little bit away from the idea, shifted quite a bit away from the idea of Kurdish independence, Kurdish nationalism to democracy. But even then, when you read what he was saying and you read what people in the movement were saying, they were still talking about Kurdish rights. They were still talking about Kurdish autonomy. And even the democratic confederalism, I mean, my reading of it, which I put forward in the book, is that, Öcalan was really saying if we can't change state structures and borders, we have to change ourselves. We have to find freedom in our own institutions. We have to create our own areas of freedom, and that way we change the state, essentially. Because he recognized that changing borders wasn't going to really happen. But throughout that all was still Kurdish nationalism. What's happened now is, over the past, year and a half, 2 years, is that the PKK has really been forced to publicly and very openly leave aside the Kurdish nationalism and its ideology and talk about democracy and freedoms in that way. And that's because that's how Öcalan is leading it. And that, I think, I would still argue that when you read Öcalan and you read even the PKK's new newspaper, which has replaced Serhibun, it's now called Commune, you can still find this idea that people will only be free when they control their own areas, when they have autonomy. And to me, that's, he's talking about Kurdish rights, but he's not really saying it openly. And this is causing a lot of dissension on the ground. People are upset and they're confused because, thousands and thousands of young men and women died. Villages, thousands of villages were destroyed. I mean, people gave their lives, they gave their wealth, they gave their time, they gave everything for the movement. And they're wondering what it is. What have they given it for right now? Now, the PKK still has two advantages. One, there's no other group like the PKK movement. There's nothing else in Turkey or in the diaspora that can lead the dialogue, that can set the agenda for Kurds. So they maintain strength based on that. Um, the other thing that I think they have going for them is that they are very they can be, well, I'd say nuanced, but they can give very conflicting messages sometimes that can give people hope. So recently, I feel Duran Kalkan in the interview he did over the this week, he talks about, it makes it sound like he's giving up everything. Like, we just want Öcalan's freedom and we want democracy and we're done. And then Nurettin Demirtas, who's Selahattin Demirtas's brother, and he's on the executive committee of the PKK, was much more hard line. We need freedom for political prisoners. We need full political rights. We're not going to have our leadership be stuck in Iraq in the mountains. So again, there are things for everybody to find and support, but you're right in that people are confused, they're unhappy, but they don't have anywhere else to go. So they're hoping that this will still lead to something that will provide them with political rights, cultural rights, and so on.
No, it makes a world of sense. And in your own book, you touched on it tonight already, but in your own book, you really go into depth about this period of 2015, and this the so-called War of the Cities, right, where there was a arguably very premature, misguided attempt to fully declare and assert not just political but like physical autonomy in the Southeast in ways that sparked massive backlash. My own understanding is it also sparked a significant kind of distancing of some of the base as well, which of course had to face the brunt of state repression, had questions about viability of the movement's goals. I wonder if you see this, you sort of alluded to it, but maybe you could say more, if you see this moment as at its best, potentially, as a kind of culmination of lessons learned going back to 2015, that in other words, maybe this like older assumptions, which what the movement often refers to as like the old paradigm, that maybe this idea that um, autonomy is something that can be simply declared and fought for through armed struggle is
Hmm.
also a part of this kind of old paradigm that needs to be transcended into this political period. And additionally, do you see this as connected to its relationship to its base? Because in other words, if you're going to not just be the heroes fighting in the mountains and winning passive support from your base, but you're actually trying to activate and organize the popular base itself through a political process, is that something you feel the movement is currently well positioned to do after all these years of war?
Right. So there is, I agree with you. There's something to be said that after 2015 and the what I call a historic mistake of the PKK to go back to war then, that Öcalan has realized this can't continue. There's no gains anymore. They either have to make it politically or they're going to fail anyway, and more people will die. Um, I think that this is in some ways a great opportunity for the movement, assuming Turkey allows free political activities. And this is what we're going to learn in the next few days. What is Turkey's agreement? Because certainly if people from the movement can return to Turkey and engage in politics, that will really shift and invigorate things in many ways. You'll have thousands of very heavily ideological, very well politically trained, very motivated young people going back and wanting to be active for their community. And this to me is what worries Ankara. And I think that this is where the peace process will live or die, or also the PKK's future will live or die. Because if Turkey doesn't allow any space for free political activity and doesn't release the political prisoners like Selahattin Demirtas and the others, then there isn't going to be space for that free political movement. And then the PKK will have agreed to something which will um, it will be unacceptable to many Kurds, I think. I think they'll be highly disillusioned with the group. That's not to say the group will finish, will end. I mean, again, as I said before, they are the only group, they are the best organized. They're very good at kind of like explaining things in a way that makes people think it makes sense. But I think it'll be very difficult. And so we come to a point where, if the PKK is ready for political action, and I think the time has long come where they need to be focused on nonviolence, will they be allowed to do that? And if they are, I think they'll be highly influential.
Yeah. Yeah, so as always, the devil is in the details, and it's going to depend in both directions, right? On what concrete actions the Turkish state is actually willing to take and how the movement adapts and responds to that. So, as you said, we'll have to stay tuned to see what Öcalan's next move is, and this we're in the middle of the story. We're not passively
Right.
observing it, 100 years later.
I know by tomorrow everything may change. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think yet again, maybe we can zoom out even further, maybe eastward to Rojhelat, as the Kurds like to call East Kurdistan or Iranian Kurdistan, because the PKK has a sister organization that's a part of this same bigger, messier Kurdish freedom movement that the PYD in Rojava, as folks know, is a part of, called PAJAK.
Mhm.
This is, for the audience who's unfamiliar, this is a sister organization that's focused exclusively on the struggle of Iranian Kurds or Rojalati Kurds for democratic autonomy in northern Iran. And it's no secret, Iran has been in the news in recent months. There's been this massive war between the US and Israel and the Iranian state. There's been multiple attempts, kind of ceasefire negotiations, and right smack dab in the middle of this story has been the question of the Kurds, quote unquote, often, of course, referred to in the mainstream media as this one big amorphous mass. Of course, you know as well as anybody else, the Kurdish community, the Kurdish movements are full of their own differences and contradictions. I wonder if you can say a bit first about Pajak itself, its origins, what maybe sets it apart from other Iranian Kurdish groups, but also in a more expansive way, maybe share your perspective on how you think the movement is seeing this moment, um, of conflict between sort of the U.S. and Israel and the Iranian state, and this question of whether or not Iranian Kurdish groups, through their new alliance, may attempt or have already started attempting to assert democratic autonomy through direct conflict with the Iranian state.
Right. So Pijak, I mean, this is one of, I think, Öcalan's more brilliant moves was, after 1999 when he was captured and he was trying to shift the PKK first to nonviolence, and then he wanted to support a democratic Turkey, and then he wanted, there was all sorts of ideas he had. And one thing that happened inside the group, which I describe in my book, is that Kurds in the PKK who were from Syria or from Iran, less or so from Iraq, were wondering what was their role. Like if the PKK was now, if Öcalan was talking about a democratic Turkey, where were they going to go? What would they do, in this case? Because even if there were peace, they certainly wouldn't be allowed into Turkey. And why would they want to go into Turkey? So he had this idea, and that was just one thing that motivated him. He had this idea that he would create local groups for each part of Kurdistan. And that was when the idea of the PYD came out, and PJAK, which was formally founded in 2003, along with the PYD. And at the time in 2003, there was a lot of the there was it was right around the time of the US invasion of Iraq, and the PKK was felt that they might be there to help the US. I mean, that it might be something that they could sort of utilize this to help free Kurds in Iran. Anyway, they never moved ahead with that. The US never attacked Iran at that moment, but PJAK stayed. They're very active, actually. I don't really go into it in my book, but I interviewed quite a few people from the group. And then around 2011, they had an unofficial ceasefire because of what was happening in Rojava. The PKK didn't want to, engage with Iran militarily, have any conflict, and so they had a ceasefire. So that changed over the past year or so, thanks to what the U.S. and together with Israel have done against Iran. PJAK is by far the best organized of the groups. I'd argue it's probably the most influential. But at the same time, it's also very practical. After the experiences in Rojava, I think there is no Kurdish group linked to the movement that would want to, believe the US on a vague promise, right? Nobody is going to operate for the US against Iran just because the US says we might help you, we might not. I think that's what we're seeing here. So it's a lot of practical issues. I mean, Iran has threatened the Kurdistan regional government, saying if Iranian Kurdish groups attack from your territory, we will go in and attack. They've already had attacks, they've sent missiles down, but they've made very broad threats. So there's a lot of pressure on the Iranian Kurdish groups not to operate. PJAK has always worked very much politically on the ground in Iran. That's what they're still doing. Um, but I think on their own, even with the other Iranian Kurdish groups, they're not in a position to take over. So they need to watch and kind of prioritize their own survival. That's been their approach right now.
And and what to make about these sort of U.S. claims of allegedly distributing arms to Kurdish groups and them maintaining that. I mean, it's a little bit laughable, but I'm just curious to hear your own, yeah,
Yeah. No, no,
yeah,
no, because I keep, everybody, then the KDP was blaming the PUK.
yeah,
Excuse me,
yeah.
PUK was blaming the KDP. Um, it seems like either weapons never went there or they were waylaid along the way, but it's not something that the Kurds were blamed. The Kurds did not do anything wrong, in my opinion. They didn't steal the weapons, they didn't stop the weapons. Seems unlikely they actually got the weapons. But it's been very hard, I know, to get one straightforward answer on it, which seems surprising, but yeah.
As always, and of course, it's a bit of a convenient excuse for Trump as well, no?
Right.
Um, well, before we open up to question and answer with the audience, I'd love to just sort of return to your book. Again, if folks haven't heard about it, Resurgence and Revolution, it's right here. Encourage people pick up a copy and read. There's a lot to learn about kind of background of the Rojava Revolution, especially, and a little bit more of the details of what has gone into, organizing, defending the institutions in northeast Syria that we know as the autonomous administration, as well as, some of the messiness, the contradictions, right? One of the biggest themes, obviously, whenever anybody tells the story of the history of the Kurdish movement, the PKK, is that of kind of crisis and transformation, right? I think it's very much woven throughout your book, especially your second book. Um, and I'm curious, in light of that theme, if you could share what you feel kind of shines through the story as some kind of overarching themes about how the movement, for better and for worse, tends to navigate crisis and go through these dramatic changes, because it feels as if we're now in the current moment in the middle of another one of these sort of major inflection points for not just the PKK, but the broader movement that they've kind of spawned and inspired and coordinated.
Hmm.
Um, so what lessons, what overarching themes have you seen about how this movement adapts to crisis and changes itself? And what do you think that should tell us all about what to expect in the coming period?
Right. That's kind of a tough question. I mean, I would say there are a couple of things that really drive the movement and that have kept it dominant, active, and popular. One is this real commitment to whatever they decide at the moment is the goal. Whether it's an independent state, whether it's building up, in the early 2000s when the PKK started sending people back into Syrian Kurdistan, into Rojava, to try to rebuild the institutions that had been broken down when Öcalan fled. There is just a real commitment. And I think, just to jump ahead, that's one of the issues right now. We don't really know what the movement is committed to at this moment, right? It's a little bit contradictory. It's quite messy, and it really depends on Öcalan's statements, which are not coming regularly. So I think that's one reason why things really seem in flux now with the movement, because they're very good when they've got their goal. When the goal is a little bit opaque, we're not really sure. Um, and the other thing I would say it is, and the other side of it is, it's just it's a commitment to activism. I mean, I've been interviewing people from the PKK now for a long time, and people who were active, starting in the 70s, if not before, until, in pre PKK movements until now. And there's a real, it's like a great work ethic. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, it's a real commitment to activism and to, putting aside personal interest, personal gain, uh, for the larger goals. And that doesn't always work perfectly. And, especially I think in Rojava, there was a time, the past couple of years, where there were complaints that, cadre were driving nice cars, they were living better than other people. You always do have that tension there. But generally, among the sort of rank and file, as it were, you find a real commitment. And kind of, everybody has their own PKK in a way. Everybody knows like what they're, some people see it as Kurdish nationalism, some people see it as democratic confederalism, some people saw it as, freeing their own town in Rojava. But a real commitment that's driven the movement. So I think those are the two things that stand out for me with the group. But this is really a time where we don't know where the movement's going to go. But
Yeah.
I believe it will survive, at least for now.
Well, that's an important first step for any movement, certainly. And it seems that the movement has a track record of doing whatever's necessary to keep stay alive and keep moving. I want to start encouraging people to write their questions in the chat, and I'm going to ask Aliza one more question before we kind of transition to the Q&A. So feel free to start typing questions, and then we'll start kind of combing through and asking them, and we'll do our best to get to everybody's, but caveats are necessary that we may not have time for every single question. Um, so, Aliza, I mean, it's no secret that you've been very critical of the movement at times, though also sympathetic to the overarching cause of, Kurdish self-determination. I think both of those things shine through clearly in your work. Um, but I'm curious if you sort of were put on the spot and or given permission to kind of share your own lessons, not thinking here about the PKK as an organization or other sort of constituent parties specifically, um, be it the PYD, PJAC, broader kind of umbrella organizations inspired by the same movement. If you were to kind of reflect on the work that you've done and your understanding of the history of this broader movement, if we take it at face value that it's aspiring to achieve self-determination for Kurdish people in the region, and larger goals of spreading structures and practices and principles of self-determination in society at large. Reflecting on lessons learned, what lessons do you think the movement should be thinking about the most? How do you think the movement should be reflecting on its own history as it struggles not just to survive, but to move forward and achieve those goals in a meaningful way into the future?
I would say the thing I would want them to reflect on, which I don't think they have yet fully, um, is their dictatorial approach to everything, to control, to political developments, political activity. I think that's been one of the PKK's strengths. The fact that they had one leader, one voice, one decision maker is one reason they did so well, especially in the 80s and 90s. There's no question. While other groups were splitting, while there were disagreements, the PKK moved forward because they had one leader. But at the same time, that's always been a weakness because of this desire to control things, whether it's diplomacy, cultural activities, education, whatever it is. You don't build up you don't establish cadre or not even cadre, you don't establish supporters and activists who can really operate on their own and can tell you based on their experiences, their best knowledge, let's say as a diplomat in Europe, what the right action is, and even having a discussion. And that's been something that the PKK has really not allowed. And I think while there's been some loosening of things after 2000, nonetheless, it's always been really still, even let's say when they were controlling cities inside Southeast Turkey between 2013 and 2015 during the peace process. It's always been very much top down. And I think I understand that for the movement, that's been useful for their survival, but I think it's ultimately hurt them because they don't get the best information. I think we saw that in some of the decision making in Rojava. We may be seeing that in some of the decision making now. So it's been their strength and it's been one of their big weaknesses. And if one thing would change, and I think it will change, should they be allowed, Kurds be allowed more freedom for politics inside Southeast Turkey, I think it will have to change
Hmm.
because without an armed movement, it will be very difficult to maintain that sort of same tight control on things.
Hmm. Well, thank you. And I've been indulgent enough in me getting to ask all the questions I want to ask. I'm going to go ahead and start turning it over and sharing some of the audience questions. Um, and I'll start with one from Gina. The question is, do you really think Turkey is sincere about the quote unquote peace process? When from the very beginning, Bahçeli and Erdogan were saying, quote, if the PKK don't disarm and dissolve, we will eliminate every last one of you. Was it blackmail rather than the start of negotiations?
Right. So I think Turkey was sincere in the idea of wanting peace, but didn't necessarily want the process that would lead to something concrete for Kurds. I think this has been the problem for negotiations between the PKK and Turkey now for years, since the start of the Oslo negotiations in 2006, 2007, and then the Imrala talks in 2013. The problem is that, or the issue is that Turkey wants peace, it wants an end to the war, but it hesitates to make the step that would actually lead to a lasting solution and that would provide the movement and Kurds with what they want. So were they sincere in wanting peace? Yes, but are they able to take the next step and see this beyond a terror issue as one of rights, cultural rights, political rights, and so on, I have my doubts. I also want to say that at the start, there was a lot of rumors, analysts were saying the reason that Erdogan's going on is starting this peace process is because he needs the Kurdish vote to extend his presidency. I think any process that started for something like that, because somebody needs something is at risk. Because the minute they don't need it anymore, they'll do something else, and he doesn't really need their vote now because he has CHP more or less on his side. So the process is at risk. The challenge is that the PKK doesn't have many options right now. Going back to war would be very difficult for them. And Erdogan knows it.
Thank you. More questions from the audience. One is specifically about Jinwar, which is a
Oh,
women,
right. I
that's
saw
women,
that.
I kind of want to take the liberty to encourage you to speak about this topic a little more expansively. So the question that's written is, does anyone have a sense of how Jinwar, the women's village west of Kamishlo, is doing? And to expand that question, if you could just share what you know about the status of the movement for women's autonomy in Rojava and where you think this is going. Of course, something a lot of people have been hearing mostly about is this question of whether or not the YPG, the women's protection units, would be integrated into the armed forces.
Right. Well, this is where I have to give a shout out to Megan Bodette, who was just there and was telling me about just this morning, was telling me about the situation for the women's movement in Rojava. And she was saying, interestingly, that the women's organizations are still standing. They have permission to keep, let's say, like the, Mala Jin houses, the women's houses. Jinwar, she didn't mention Jinwar specifically, but my understanding is there are still people in Jinwar. It's still going on. I mean, that isn't something that would I think that would bother Shara. I mean, he may not want, he may not be a fan of this movement's level of rights for women, but I mean, it's a village that wouldn't come under his, I think, radar. So, and I've always felt that the women's movement inside the PKK and inside PKK affiliates is really the strongest ideologically because women have the most to gain from this and the most to lose. So they have remained very strong, and we see that with the YPJ, which that still hasn't been finalized. Um, but the women's movement, as Megan explained to me, continues very well there.
Thank you so much. There's another question. Could the Democratic Autonomous Administration have managed or set up its foreign
Mm.
relations differently? Did they have the equivalent of a Ministry of Foreign Relations? What about now?
Right, so they did, yeah, that's a great question. And they had some sort of rotating chair of foreign relations people, including Ilham Ahmed, Asya Abdullah, and others. But this is like gets back to the issue I raised earlier, which is that I think the PKK's dictatorial spirit and this sort of top-down control has really hurt it. And this is an example. I don't think they ever really opened it up. They weren't looking for other views. They weren't engaging in Europe broadly enough to help build up a very active and professional foreign relations department. And granted, they had a lot against them. They were fighting wars until what, 2019 with ISIS. They weren't fully accepted. Many of them came from, difficult backgrounds, had been in the mountains for many years. So, it's difficult to make that transition. But I think they could have set up a better foreign relations, but that requires generally devolving some power. And that's always been a block for the movement.
Thank you, Lisa. Another question is about, you touched on this a little bit, has to do with at least rumors of kind of some personalized criticism of Muslim Abdi or Muslim Kobani's leadership, somebody who you have met and interviewed personally. What is your sense, if not just about Muslim Kobani personally, but larger questions of internal divisions or differences around strategy? In good faith, to read the phrasing of the question. You mentioned that some side of the AANES was more critical of Muslim retroactively. Which side of the administration was critical of Muslim Kobani? What were the critiques for?
Right. I think there were some quiet critiques. I wouldn't say it was like specifically a certain side of ANES or not. And there's also been some subtle critiques from the movement in Kandil towards Muslim. Look, I mean the critiques were things that retrospectively make sense. Should he have negotiated better with the with Shara? Should he have negotiated more quickly? Should he have looked to maybe try to trade the Arab majority areas for something specific? But I wouldn't criticize him personally for this. These are things I think the movement as a whole has responsibility for. Because obviously Muslim is not the only one making decisions there. There's a whole group of people in Rojava and then outside Rojava who are making decisions. And there's no question. I mean, I've interviewed Muslim multiple times, and I mean, everybody knows his name. He's always been very committed to the gains of the Rojava Revolution. So whatever mistakes he may have made, probably anybody would have made them. It's very difficult to say he made a mistake. I think the situation was against him from the beginning, and honestly, had he done other things, it still could have ended this way because at the end of the day, the Rojava administration didn't have a backer like the United States or Europe that was going to stand up to Shara for them. So it really didn't matter what the administration did. At the end, the power was with Shara, the legitimacy was with Shara, and that's what decided the fate of Rojava.
Right. A more general question to kind of switch gears here is how have Kurdish political movements like the PKK influenced the way Kurdish identity is understood today?
Wow. If I've ever, I mean, I think they've had a huge influence on how we understand. I mean, the movement has, helped define Kurdish identity, inside Turkey, inside Rojava, to a certain extent, even among certain people in, Iraq and certainly in Iran. I mean, this has defined it. It has led the Kurdish identity, has promoted Kurdish identity. And so what we understand, if you're asking from outside of Kurdistan, what we understand, what we know, is really filtered through what the movement has done for Kurds, whether one agrees with everything or not. I mean, the PKK has driven development, the understanding of Kurdish identity.
No, absolutely, without a doubt. Um, Getting back to sort of strategic questions, there's one here that I'm gonna sh just shorten for brevity. Do you see that in 3 or 4 years, with a different administration in the US and maybe in Turkey, that conditions could be more favorable to the revolution to improve its staying power? I think specifically talking about Rojava here, but maybe more broadly as well.
You mean in the future, whether in the future
In the
this could
future,
be?
whether in several years from now, situate the political conditions or other conditions could change such that the movement could be in a stronger position, and could they last until then to be able to actually capitalize on that?
Yeah, I think it's too early. Like right now the situation in Rojava is highly in flux. The situation in Syria is highly in flux. So we don't know where this will change. I do think that if the PKK can stick to giving up armed struggle and can actually, recreate itself as a legitimate political force, which, by the way, even if it can't do that in Turkey, there's nothing that stops it from doing it in Europe or elsewhere, right? I think that there will still be a lot of time for the movement to reassert and define what happens not just in Rojava but elsewhere for Kurds. But it depends on whether the movement can gain legitimacy from a transformation to a nonviolent organization. It depends on that.
Well, I think that we would it would be a shortcoming of failure to fail to just go ahead and dive straight in at some point to the your favorite messy topic, which is Abdullah Öcalan himself. It's been the source of some controversy amongst supporters of the movement, maybe different pieces of your analysis about Abdullah Öcalan's decisions, behavior, manner of governing the movement from within. And so I kind of want to I'm going to try to kind of merge a couple, two or three different questions that touch on this topic, and just curious to hear any of your thoughts or reactions. One person had asked simply, "Do you think it's healthy for everyone to rely on Öcalan so much?" But another person mentioned a question about to kind of push back on your analysis in your first book about
Yeah.
the killing of Samir, which we could maybe expand to the larger question of internal persecutions or differences and how they played out within the party. The heart of the question is essentially that your own analysis was that this alleged killing or others like it were due to resistance against democracy and against sort of pushes to democratize the party. And the person asking the question is pushing back, saying that the Öcalan himself had mentioned this as a security concern. So let's see here, just out of good faith to read the
Yeah, I'm
audience.
desperate to answer that question,
Yeah, yeah, no,
actually.
I'm sure it's good. This is how
It's a
we.
good question. I
Yeah.
mean, and it gets,
In Öcalan's book, you cited about liquidation, where he mentions this death. He never states democracy itself was a problem. He said it was a security issue.
of
The
course.
PKK's first manifesto, when the PKK was Marxist, also emphasized the importance on democracy. Is there a reason you didn't mention this in your book and confront these statements, excuse me, to make your point about Öcalan's authoritarianism?
Look, the whole point is that the PKK in that period used the word democracy very loosely. And the fact that Öcalan didn't I mean, Öcalan, of course, saw this as a security issue. I mean, when Çetin Güngör Semir came out against the PKK, Öcalan, not just Öcalan, everybody in the movement at the time was quite, it was still a relatively small group. They saw Semir as a threat. They saw because their their approach was anybody who criticizes us, anybody who disagrees with us, is undermining us and is a threat. And it was a very violent period. And the way the PKK dealt with this was by killing opponents. And so they killed him. Now Semir's concerns about democracy and so on. Also, let's not over exaggerate. I mean, he wasn't talking about democracy like, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson or whatever. I mean, he was talking about, very basics, other people having the right to speak, his concerns about Öcalan's growing dictatorial approach. But this was and this was not uncommon. I mean, he wasn't the only person killed. He wasn't the only person who split off from the group. He wasn't the only person who criticized. Does that mean that had he split off and founded another group, it would have been a fully democratic group? Unlikely, because I think their understanding of democracy at the time was still somewhat narrow. But there's no question that for the PKK, and this is, also been one of its strengths, anybody who tries to split off and form an alternate group at that time was a traitor. And that's what helped keep the PKK strong and united. So, may not have been the best method, but for them it was. Um, so, I have to ask, is Öcalan an MIT plant? Can I just answer that? No, no.
Oh yeah, go ahead and answer
He's
that.
not. He's not. And I've heard this so many times from people. I mean, I remember somebody when my first book came out, a Kurd who had been in the PKK said to me, your book is great, except you missed one thing. You forgot to mention that Öcalan worked with MIT to found the PKK. I was like, that's just not true.
Yeah.
I mean, in all my years of research, had any of that been true, I believe I would have discovered it. Is Öcalan influenced by the last people who speak to him in prison? Yes. Is information controlled that he gets? Yes. And that obviously has an impact on his decision making and his ideas. I think Kandil knows that. In fact, Kandil for sure knows that. So, but he's not a MIT agent, and the PKK was not founded by MIT.
And for
But I
those
do
who,
get that question a lot.
I believe you. For those who don't No, MIT
Oh,
is not the Massachusetts Institute for Technology.
right. Sorry, I should have said that. Yeah.
Right, it's an acronym for the Turkish State's Intelligence Agency, kind of their
Yeah.
equivalent of the CIA, FBI mixed together. Um, Another question. Historically, the PKK has tried to assert distance from the Dem party, even while Dem is largely dominated by Kurdish concerns. And as you know, Dem mayors and other party officials have been arrested and removed from their positions. How dependent on the Öcalan peace negotiations do you think the Dem party's future is at this moment? Would you assess its future viability within both the parliament and on the local level? And in my facilitator privileges, I might ask you to maybe just give brief mention of the fact this is not just about Dem, but there's a kind of historic legacy in which you touch on in your work of kind of allied or related legal political parties within Turkey that have a relationship to the movement and the
Right.
PKK.
So the Dem Party is just the latest
Right.
iteration of the Kurdish political party that started in 1989. And it's true that and these parties have, every few years, Turkish Constitutional Court has shut them down, and so they've, reformed with another name. So it's basically the same party, but different people depending on who's in prison or who isn't. So the latest iteration is Dem. I don't agree that the PKK has tried to assert distance from the Dem party. I think the PKK has always tried to, exert a certain amount of control, certainly influence on the party. Um, but I do think that Öcalan's peace negotiations, look, for them, the peace process is very important because they want to see, I mean, their whole existence is based on the idea that, problems should be solved through political activities. And a lot of the pressures on the party and the jailing of its members have been done under the excuse that, they're supporting the PKK or they've worked for the PKK or they've spoken out for the PKK. So, in a free situation, I think the Dem Party sees itself as being able to be very active and very even, influential in decision making inside Turkey. I think that if the process goes ahead, the Dem Party continue will become a real important voice for Kurds because it will be the only real voice for Kurds at that point. So I think it will continue, it will be viable, it can even grow. If the process collapses, they'll continue to be sidelined. It'll be very difficult for them.
All right. So another question from Flint Arthur, I believe. Welcome, Flint. The fate of Rojava is the theme of the question, with a bit of a lead up here. PYD governor of Hesika, PYD mayor of Kobani, PYD mayor of Kamishlo, YPG integrated into Hesika brigades, declaring they remain committed to their goal of protecting the people. Integration of 9,000 Asaish into the Ministry of the Interior. IDPs returned to Afrin, including Ilham Ahmed, and security to be recruited from among the IDPs. Autonomous administration curriculum guaranteed for 2026
Oh,
and 27. Energy deal between Jazeera Oil Company, SPCHKN Energy, et cetera, et cetera. You get the point. So, the fate of Rojava Revolution, is it ended? Is it postponed? Is it sustained? What is your take?
I think Flint answered it there. It continues, but in a different format, right? There's no question. It's not what we knew it before, where they operated, independent of Damascus. Now they're operating as part of Damascus, together with Damascus. But the revolution continues. We just, it's just operating differently now.
Right, fair enough. And as we've been saying, the story is still unfinished.
Right.
All right. There's a kind of simple factual question, which depends on whether you have data on the top of your head, but I want to ask it anyway. Are there any stats for how many SDF, Asaish, and Kurdish civilians were killed at the hands of the SAA and SNA and their affiliates since January 8th, 2026 until now? For those in the audience who aren't familiar, SAA refers to the Syrian Arab Army, the official military of the regime. The SNA refers to the Syrian National Army, which is a kind of constellation of militias essentially backed and controlled by the Turkish state.
You know what? I don't have those numbers. That was asked recently. It's somewhere in some story, some article. I read it. So recently Muslim gave the numbers, but I don't know them. But I think it was a few hundred, at least.
Hmm.
Excellent. Mm.
So we're just gonna take a couple more, and again, we're doing our best to get to everybody, so no hard feelings. And then we know everybody's got it's a late night for you East Coasters, but we're really grateful to have you. Um, Another question, assuming that the peace
Mm.
process continues to veer towards the quote terror-free Turkey outcome and not a quote democratic nation framework, so a military capitulation without expanded rights, what options are left on the table for the PKK, and what other figures or forces might seek to take leadership of a future Kurdish national movement?
Right. Yeah, that is a great question. I think in the short run, the PKK will survive because it still controls major organizations outside of Turkey, inside of Turkey. It has finances. It's still obviously highly active in Rojava through directly and indirectly. Um, but over time, I think it would be difficult for the group. In that situation, what concerns me is that you will have a new outbreak of violence at some point. That in a terror-free Turkey, that leaves it open for people to still be arrested for activism and for what they say. And there's a point where things would be, the remnants of the PKK or young people would be pushed over the edge and start a new rebellion. So I think that's a risk. I don't see any other like groups right now ready to take leadership of a future Kurdish movement. I would instead expect within the movement there'd be some sort of new leadership that would emerge because as we know, Öcalan and the others are quite old, so at some point there is going to be a generational change. But a terror-free Turkey, in my mind, is a very risky solution because it's terror-free only for a certain length. I mean, people will need to have something.
Right. Well, I think we're going to close out with this last question, which is on the topic of the communes. And I think it's kind of fitting because in ECR, a lot of our participants, supporters, followers, audience, call it what you will, um, come to these conversations out of a sense of a real taking real inspiration from the movement's practices and aspirations towards building, authentically self-governed society on the ground. We all know and accept that the theory and practice are two different things, and the movement's ability to achieve its full vision of democratic confederalism is different from sort of the constraints it's faced on the ground, and also internal shortcomings have prevented it from realizing that full potential. But this question kind of ends us off with this question, rooting things back down to the communes. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts as we close out. Um, Questions as follows. Toward the end of last year, there was an internal push for communes to be reformed, more active, ensuring politicians are active in their local communes, more participatory, etc. Then January happened. Öcalan and the movement's ideology seems to be doubling down on the importance of the commune, though definition seems broader than just street level communes. But a recent article by Syria in Transition says that the communes have all but ceased to function in Rojava. It seems communes are a way to preserve the movement at the base. Do you know any more about their current state, and do you see as something in the movement will again prioritize? Do you see communes as something the movement will continue to prioritize
Yeah,
prioritize
I
again?
think the communes are very important. I mean, they're by virtue of the shifts in relationship with Damascus and so on, and how people get fuel and economic, energy and things like that, it makes sense that the communes would probably lose a little bit of control because they were so important for getting services and things like that. I think the movement will probably double down on communes precisely because they're so important for transmitting ideology and maintaining some sort of authority there. So I would expect them, to continue or redouble their efforts.
Right. Well, I think it's safe to say for a lot of us that's encouraging to hear. 'Cause a lot of us take our interest and inspiration from this idea of building grassroots democracy, and would love to see this movement flourish in a new form, or at least survive and continue to find ways to develop these institutions under new conditions. So, to bring up a phrase that Öcalan himself has brought up at times, and that our lefty audience is probably familiar with, this idea of a dual power of kind of building the new in the shell of the old. Seems like it maybe is coming to an all new sense of meaning and importance under conditions where we cannot expect a Syrian regime headed by Ahmed al-Shara to be formally integrating, democratic confederalism as the structure of the new Syrian state. So we'll all have to stay tuned and see how this story continues to unfold. But without taking it any further, Aliza, I just want to thank you again so much for taking the time to join us today. Again, Aliza's new book is Resurgence and Revolution. I'm sure you can find it wherever you can find books. We will be sure to drop a link in future posts and emails if you're on our newsletter. But also want to encourage people to, if you're not already connected to ECR, to connect with us. You can email us at info@defendrojava.org. You can go to our website, defendrojava.org, for more information. You also can follow us on most social media, as you probably guessed, at Defend Rojava. Aliza, do you have any final comments you want to say, or anything you want to say to the audience before we?
Well, one, it was really interesting, and I want to say that, I'm always open for more discussion. You can reach me through Gmail, my full name, Gmail, or on Twitter.
Right.
I'm definitely interested in just that. I think it's really, it's great to see this interest and commitment to it, to what the movement has tried to do in Rojava, and I do think that it's too early to make any decisions on where this is going to go, but
Yeah.
it's very clear that, people remain committed to certain things on the ground, and they're trying to manage the situation as best they can.
Right. That much really seems clear, and we appreciate your kind of historical perspective on the question. And I also might add that, uh, you know, I think it's positive and healthy that we also bring a little bit of critical back and forth to the conversation. If anything's in the spirit of the Kurdish freedom movement, it's the idea of criticism and discussion, right? So the idea that there's a non-zero amount of controversy around the messy history of the Kurdish freedom movement, the internal workings of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, et cetera, et cetera. None of that needs to overshadow our all of our shared kind of interests and inspiration, the idea of Kurdish self-determination and the self-determination of all peoples, which I think we can all agree this movement has been fighting for on the ground for some time. So I think you don't have to even agree with everything to get so much out of this book. So I encourage people to read it, think about it, discuss it, um, and do an honest job as best you can. That's all we can do, is to learn what we can. And in a time when the movement is facing this kind of inflection point, right, it's all the more important that we think critically, think strategically, especially those of us who maybe are inspired to try to build and participate in social movements in our own communities and our own countries, to think very clear about the lessons learned through the history of this movement, just like any other movement. So again, thank you all.
Okay,
Solidarity
thank you
to
all.
everybody.
Thank you.
Until next time, thanks, Aliza. We'll be in touch.
Thanks. Okay, great. Thanks. Bye.
Cheers.